Arthur Schopenhauer was one of the most brutally honest philosophers in history. His views on life, suffering, and human nature were famously bleak, but it was his shocking opinions about women that stirred the most controversy. In a world that was starting to romanticize love and equality, Schopenhauer took a dagger to illusion and exposed what he believed were uncomfortable truths. He confessed what most men didn't want to admit, and what most women refused to hear. This video isn't about hate. It's about understanding the raw, unfiltered mind of a man who saw the world differently. Whether you agree or not, what Schopenhauer said might just explain a lot more than you think. Arthur Schopenhauer was not known for being gentle with his words. When it came to women, his thoughts were not just controversial, they were incendiary, even by the standards of his time. In his essay, On Women, he launched a philosophical grenade that still echoes today. To Schopenhauer, women were not the romantic, angelic beings portrayed in poetry or courtly love. Instead, he described them in cold biological terms, as instruments of nature, designed with a single purpose in mind: the continuation of the species. This wasn't personal bitterness, he claimed. It was pure, logical observation. He believed that the idealization of women was one of the great delusions of modern man, and that until this illusion was shattered, men would remain trapped in roles of servitude and emotional dependence. Schopenhauer didn't just question women's nature, he outright rejected the growing idea that women were equal to men in intellect, creativity, or moral strength. To him, these were comforting lies societies told themselves to avoid confronting the brutal truth. He argued that women were short-sighted in thought, incapable of deep philosophical insight, and fundamentally pragmatic, concerned with survival, family, and status, rather than with lofty ideals or noble pursuits. Their charm, beauty, and gentleness were not spiritual qualities, but survival tools, he claimed, evolutionary strategies for securing male protection and resources. In Schopenhauer's coldly rational world, everything had a function, and that function was reproductive. He didn't hate women, per se. Rather, he saw them as playing a role that nature had carved out for them, just as men had theirs. But where men suffered was in mistaking the performance for reality. They fell in love with the illusion, not the individual. They projected ideals onto women that no real person could live up to. And when the illusion inevitably collapsed, when beauty faded, affection waned, or betrayal occurred, men were devastated, not because they were wronged, but because they had lied to themselves. Schopenhauer's critique, then, was less about women and more about men's inability to see clearly. He urged men to stop worshipping false gods and start confronting the truth, even if it was bleak, even if it hurt. Central to Schopenhauer's philosophy was the idea that love is not noble or transcendent. It is nature's cruelest trick. He insisted that romantic love is nothing more than a biological trap designed to fool men into reproducing. On the surface, love feels intense, intoxicating, even divine. It drives men to create art, write poetry, and make lifelong sacrifices. But underneath all the passion, Schopenhauer believed, lies a ruthless evolutionary mechanism. He wrote that men do not choose who they love. Nature chooses for them. Nature selects a partner not based on compatibility, kindness, or intellect, but on the likelihood of producing healthy offspring. And once that purpose is fulfilled, once the children are born, the illusion evaporates. What remains is often conflict, resentment, and confusion. He argued that the very things we think are personal, our taste in partners, our longing for connection, our heartbreak, are actually impersonal forces beyond our control. Love, in Schopenhauer's view, is the will to life acting through us. The will is blind, irrational, and cares nothing for our happiness. It only wants to survive, to reproduce, to continue the species. That's why men are often drawn to women who seem irrationally captivating, because, subconsciously, their bodies have been selected by nature to trigger desire. But once nature gets what it wants, the mask drops, and then begins the slow, painful realization that what felt like destiny was merely biology. This perspective strips love of all its poetry. It reframes relationships not as partnerships between equals, but as temporary alliances forged by evolutionary pressure. For men, this realization can be devastating. They invest everything, emotionally, financially, spiritually, into a bond that may have been programmed to dissolve the moment its biological purpose is achieved. Schopenhauer believed that unless men woke up to this manipulation, they would continue to be used by forces they barely understood. And perhaps worst of all, they would continue to blame themselves when things fell apart. To many, these ideas sound heartless, but Schopenhauer believed he was offering men a form of liberation. If love is not sacred, then neither is heartbreak. If desire is not destiny, then neither is suffering. To see clearly, even if the truth is ugly, is better than to live in beautiful lies. In his view, men had to stop being slaves to illusion, stop imagining that love would save them or that women would complete them. Only then could they reclaim their power. Only then could they begin to live by reason instead of instinct. One of Schopenhauer's most provocative arguments was his claim that society clings to a dangerous illusion, the myth of female moral superiority. He observed that throughout history, women have often been portrayed as gentle, pure, nurturing beings, embodiments of kindness and compassion. From the Virgin Mary to the romanticized heroines of literature, the feminine ideal was lifted high, far above the base instincts and destructive impulses typically attributed to men. But Schopenhauer rejected this narrative outright. He argued that the widespread belief in women's innocence wasn't rooted in truth. It was the result of centuries of idealization, chivalric delusion, and willful blindness. In his words, society had created a goddess out of convenience, not out of reality. He believed this idealization served a specific function. It allowed men to justify their sacrifices. Men went to war, built nations, died young, and worked themselves to the bone, all under the banner of protecting and providing for women. If women were seen as morally superior, then men's suffering became noble. But Schopenhauer called this a lie, a self-deception that kept men enslaved to a fantasy. He claimed that women were not morally better or more virtuous. Rather, they simply had different forms of expression, shaped by biological necessity and social constraints. Their behaviors were not born from higher principles, but from instincts geared towards survival, reproduction, and resource acquisition. He pointed out that much of what is interpreted as feminine virtue, modesty, humility, tenderness, is not evidence of deeper goodness, but a form of strategic self-presentation. He described women as the weaker sex, not just in physical terms, but in will. He believed that women were more inclined to follow convention, to seek security, and to act through manipulation rather than open conflict. According to Schopenhauer, these tendencies were not inherently evil, but they certainly weren't signs of moral greatness either. They were practical tools developed over centuries of depending on male provision and protection. And once those tools were mistaken for moral virtues, men were bound to misjudge the reality of their relationships. Schopenhauer was particularly disturbed by what he saw as the hypocrisy of modern gender roles. He noted that men were held to high standards of duty, courage, and achievement, while women were praised simply for being. A man who failed to provide or protect was shamed. A woman, on the other hand, could fail in her responsibilities and still be seen as morally upright, simply because of her perceived emotional sensitivity. This double standard, he argued, led to an unbalanced society where men carried the weight of civilization, yet were expected to remain silent about their disillusionment. He wrote that many women were childlike in reasoning and lacking in the ability to comprehend great ideas. This wasn't meant to insult, he claimed, but to describe a fundamental difference in how men and women process the world. Men, to Schopenhauer, were shaped by struggle. They were hardened by competition, intellect, and suffering. Women, he argued, were protected from these things, and so remained closer to nature, governed more by emotion and instinct than by abstract reasoning. This, he believed, was the real reason women seemed more peaceful or morally clean. They simply had fewer opportunities and less capacity to engage with the darker, more complex aspects of life. In the modern world, Schopenhauer warned, this illusion had grown even stronger. As societies advanced and women gained more visibility, the ideal of the morally superior woman only intensified. Media, literature, and education reinforced the narrative that women were humanity's emotional compass, kinder, wiser, more in tune with what matters. But Schopenhauer would have none of it. He believed that this new mythology was not a sign of progress, but of increasing delusion. By failing to see women as they truly were, flawed, human, and just as capable of vice as virtue, men remained vulnerable to manipulation and heartbreak. They continued to put women on pedestals, only to be crushed when reality failed to meet expectations. Perhaps Schopenhauer's most unsettling suggestion was that most men didn't want to see the truth. They preferred the illusion. They wanted to believe in feminine innocence, not because it was real, but because it gave their suffering meaning. It allowed them to feel like heroes, martyrs, and lovers in a grand romantic tale. But to awaken from that dream, to truly see the other as an equal in flaws, capable of both great love and great cruelty, was to lose that meaning. And for many, that loss was too great to bear. In the end, Schopenhauer's goal wasn't to demonize women. It was to expose the fantasy that kept men emotionally enslaved. He believed that only by rejecting the myth of female moral superiority could men achieve true clarity and inner strength. Only then could relationships be built on reality, not illusion. His message was harsh, unflinching, and deeply unpopular. But for those willing to listen, it held a radical form of liberation. The freedom to see things as they are, not as we wish them to be. Schopenhauer believed that one of the great silent tragedies of modern life was the unspoken suffering of men. While the world celebrated romantic love, feminine beauty, and the sacredness of family, he saw something much darker hidden beneath it all. A quiet army of men who had surrendered their lives to illusions and were paying for it in silence. From a young age, Schopenhauer argued, men are conditioned to believe that their worth comes from what they can give, build, or endure. They are not taught to value themselves for who they are, but for how useful they are to others, especially to women and society at large. This conditioning begins in childhood. Boys are often praised for being strong, independent, and self-sacrificing. If they cry, they are told to toughen up. If they speak of loneliness, they are told to distract themselves with work. And if they ever question the expectations placed on them, to provide, to protect, to persevere no matter what, they are labeled weak or unmanly. Over time, this creates a man who no longer knows how to express pain. He learns to suppress his emotions, to wear a mask of confidence even when he is drowning inside. Schopenhauer saw this not as strength, but as tragedy. He believed that men were being used, not by women directly, but by the hidden forces of nature and culture working through them. Romantic love, according to Schopenhauer, is one of the most effective tools for this manipulation. A man falls in love not because he freely chooses to, but because nature drives him toward a woman who will best reproduce his traits. He feels passion, longing, and devotion, but underneath all of it is the will to life using him as a pawn. He sacrifices his dreams, his wealth, sometimes even his sanity, in the name of this love. He may marry, have children, and spend decades providing, only to find himself discarded or forgotten when he is no longer useful. And when that happens, society does not weep for him. It tells him he should have tried harder, that he was never enough. Schopenhauer found this deeply unjust. He pointed out that men, far more than women, are likely to face existential despair when relationships fail, because so much of their identity has been tied to being a provider or protector. They often have nothing left when those roles vanish. They are left with empty bank accounts, broken homes, and a society that ridicules their pain. Worse still, when men do express frustration or criticize the system, they are accused of bitterness or misogyny, further silencing their voices and reinforcing their isolation. In Schopenhauer's eyes, this suffering was not random. It was systemic. Men were not simply unlucky in love. They were trapped in a structure designed to exploit their biology and their sense of duty. Women, guided by the same natural instincts, seek protection, stability, and upward mobility. These instincts are not evil. They are just nature's design. But when combined with a culture that idealizes women and shames male vulnerability, it creates an imbalance where men give everything, often receiving very little in return, and yet they are told to be grateful, to be proud, to suffer quietly as a badge of honor. So what, then, is the solution? For Schopenhauer, it wasn't to hate women or relationships. It was to awaken, to see clearly. He urged men to detach themselves from the illusions that bind them. Stop thinking that love is salvation. Stop believing that sacrifice will earn you happiness. Stop assuming that suffering in silence makes you noble. He wanted men to reclaim their minds from the grip of fantasy, to understand that they had been seduced not by individual women, but by the deeper forces of the will, forces that cared nothing for their well-being. And yet, this awakening is not easy. To reject the myths of romance and feminine perfection is to step into a lonely, often uncomfortable truth. It means letting go of dreams you were taught to hold sacred. It means facing the fact that much of what you believed about love, purpose, and identity may have been built on lies. But in that destruction, Schopenhauer believed, there is also freedom. Because once a man sees the world as it is, not as he wishes it to be, he is no longer a slave to it. He can begin to live with clarity, with self-awareness, and with a kind of inner strength that no external validation can give him. This was Schopenhauer's ultimate gift to modern men. Not bitterness, but liberation. By exposing the illusions, he offered the chance to rise above them. In a world that constantly demands your loyalty, your sacrifice, your silence, perhaps the most radical thing a man can do is to open his eyes, to see clearly, to think freely, to choose a life not shaped by instincts or manipulation, but by his own reason and understanding. Schopenhauer's philosophy, though dark, contains a rare kind of hope. The hope that truth, even when painful, is better than ignorance. That clarity, even when it isolates you, is better than blind devotion. He did not expect the world to listen. He knew that most men would continue to worship illusions, to sacrifice for love, to suffer in silence. But for the few who dared to question it all, for the few who sought something real, his words were a confession, a warning, and perhaps most importantly, a call to awaken.